So I said that this was a successful project, and I do believe that it really was. The best example, I think, of its successfulness, on its own terms, was that it survived the biggest challenge of its time, of this first period that we are talking about. First with the Japanese attempt under Toyotomi Hideyoshi at taking over Korea, and possibly also having in mind taking over at least significant parts of Ming China, and then the Qing attempts at controlling Korea, the Jurchen, Manchu, Qing attempts at controlling Korea in the 1620s and the 1630s.
Good afternoon.
진행자가 한 사람의 이름을 부르는데요. 그러자 강의를 준비하는 오드아른의 베스타 교수.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's wonderful to be here. It's a real honor and pleasure for me to do the Reichauer lectures here at Harvard.
강의가 진행된 이곳은 명문대라 불리는 하버드 대학교. 오늘은 여기에서 한국인 하면 빼놓을 수 없는 정신에 대해 강의를 한다는데요.
Now, in the overall title for these lectures, Empire and Righteous Nation, there are three concepts that I would like to explore a bit at the start of the first lecture. Empire, nation, and righteous. Righteous, of course, refers to Korea, but it doesn't mean that all Koreans are righteous, or even that the Korean state at any point or in any form has been a righteous state. It's there to indicate that the search for a righteous approach to domestic and international affairs has preoccupied many generations of Koreans very much. Let's then turn to the second of my concepts, nation. And here, of course, I'm speaking about Korea. To speak about Korea, and especially pre-20th century Korea, as a nation. And historians have been discussing this for a very long time. Some of us have tried to elude this question by simply pointing to the great coherence in cultural and linguistic terms of people who live on the Korean peninsula. And of course, this is a process that does go back a very long time, at least 3,000 years. So in linguistic terms, you're going to hear a little bit about linguistics in these lectures. Not much, I promise you, but a little bit. In linguistic terms, modern Korean derives from Middle Korean, which in turn derives from, you guessed it, Old Korean, which has its roots, linguists believe, in some form of Proto-Korean. So not much change there. Actually, great change in terms of language, but not much change in terms of an overall departure, moving in a different direction. So there is something that's been going on for a very long time here that one needs to think about. China is not like that. Japan also is not like that, or at least not quite in the same way. So in this sense, within its own region, Korea is quite unique. But of course, looking at it this way is a typical historian's cop-out, right? You say that something exists because it's always existed and that you can't quite describe what it is.
이 말을 하며 재밌다는 듯 활짝 웃는 베스타 교수님과 옆에 다른 교수님.
So I'll try to get a little bit closer to the issue than that. Now, the point is, of course, that not everything that is distinct becomes a nation in any meaningful sense of the term, or certainly not a nation before historians started inventing nations in Europe in the 19th century. It's about defining who is out, who the nation, who does not belong with the nation. So what then about East Asia, and what about Korea? Now, there are people who argue, and I'm going to talk more about this in a little bit, that Korean concepts of nation is something that go far back in time. Not using the term nation, not necessarily using principles of exclusion, but more in the form that Anthony Smith, my former colleague at LSE, defined nation as a group sharing a historic territory, common myths, and historical memories. If that is true, overall as a definition, then Korea, I think, for quite some time falls into that definition, and perhaps further back than Europe in the 19th century. It is quite possible, it is quite meaningful, at least to me, to think of the form of cohesion that people living on the Korean peninsula had created amongst themselves prior to the European influences in intellectual terms, political terms of the 19th century, as some form of nation. And then finally, the third concept, righteous. So, I in Chinese, or ui in Korean, and you see it up there, that's a good traditional.
화면에 커다랗게 의라는 한자가 보이자 앉아서 강의를 듣던 하버드 교수님들도 일제히 고개를 들었습니다. 베스타 교수님은 이어 설명했습니다.
Is perhaps especially in the form of concepts of moral fitness, of loyalty, of fidelity to principles, all, as you will know, essential parts of the Neo-Confucian creed coming out of China about 1,000 years ago, and taken up especially in Korea. So this Neo-Confucian concept of righteousness is something that has inspired generation after generation of Koreans, elite Koreans to be sure, in order to define the content of their own state. And that goes beyond just the issue of who we are in a kind of ethnic sense. The concept of the Korean state as being particularly preoccupied with righteousness. We're sometimes attacked by the Chinese for this. That is not. It is interesting how this character has become a slogan for various Korean political projects over a period at least of the 600 years that I'm talking about here. So the Popular Army in the operation against the Japanese invasions in the 1580s called themselves the Righteous Army, or Uibyeong. And you will find it in the resistance against Japan in the 20th century, and you find it in numerous political upheavals in South Korea towards the end of the 20th century. So it is a significant concept.
한국이 의로움으로 맞서 싸웠다는 말을 한 베스타 교수님은 한동안 의라는 글자를 보며 말을 잊지 못했습니다. 그리고 입을 떼는데요.
Now, in terms of breaking points, for this whole region that we are talking about here, in the spirit of Ambassador Russia, there is probably no more important breaking point than the late 14th century. First, the Ming Empire in the 1360s, and then the Joseon Empire or state in Korea in the 1380s and 1390s. But if the Ming was a great project, Joseon in Korea was even more of a project, was even more of a break with the past and an attempt to put something new in its place. It was not an entire break with Korea's past. It built on Korea's past to quite some extent. But it was an attempt at refining, finessing, and first and foremost ordering the way the state behaved. It was nothing less than the remaking of Korean society according to the principles of Neo-Confucianism. In a very authoritarian form, led by the elites, very, very hierarchical, but crucially, and this is what is different from almost any other Neo-Confucian projects across East Asia, and there were many of them, based on the voluntary or involuntary participation of almost everyone within Korean society. And that was, I think, because it turned out to be a very successful project, that's what gave it such deep roots. Of course, there were groups that were excluded from any concept of Confucian rectitude. Korea was a caste system. It was a slave-holding system, which I'll talk about.
한국에 있었던 신분 사회에 대해 간략히 설명하는 교수님.
But among the people who had some form of franchise in terms of participation, this was expected to be universal. So I said that this was a successful project, and I do believe that it really was.
신분이 있었음에도 한국은 항상 한마음이었다며 그럴 수 있었던 이유를 설명하는데요.
But because it was able to imprint itself so deeply on the population that it ruled. And it was successful also in another sense. It created a state that had a great deal of capacity in various forms. And this is something that's often forgotten when we talk about Korea during these years, mainly its relationship with the Ming and Qing empires. One tends to forget the ability of Korean rulers to cling on to power, to have a successful state that continued for a very long period of time. Socially unjust as it was, as I already alluded to, and with enormous problems in terms of at least some aspects of innovation. The best example, I think, of its successfulness on its own terms was that it survived the biggest challenge of its time, of this first period that we are talking about here, which was the great East Asian wars of the late 16th and early 17th century. So what you could call East Asia's World War. First with the Japanese attempt under Toyotomi Hideyoshi at taking over Korea and possibly also having in mind taking over at least significant parts of Ming China, and then the Qing attempts at controlling Korea, the Jurchen, Manchu, Qing attempts at controlling Korea in the 1620s and the 1630s. For a region that saw itself as a world, quite rightly, this was a world war. And it was an enormously testing experience for all the polities that were involved. Two of them didn't survive. And surprisingly enough, the one who did was Korea, was Joseon Korea. Ming collapsed. Hideyoshi experiment went nowhere, ended in tears and defeat. Joseon was the one that survived. And that says something about the internal cohesion that was there, the ability to survive disasters when inflicted on the country. Possibly also, and this is something I'd love for us to discuss later on, because the concept of state was slightly different, maybe for the very reason that Korea was not an empire. Was it possible to get some kind of continuity beyond this? And it would at first focus on the relationship between the two and put it under a pressure that it hadn't seen for almost 500 years. But that is the topic for the lecture tomorrow. If you want to get the rest of this very exciting story, you have to come along here at 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Thank you very much. And now, Kirk, over to you.
박수와 함께 베스타 교수님의 강의가 끝나고 강의에 대해 질문하는 시간을 가졌습니다.
Maybe I will start with the first question to Professor Westad.
질문이 시작되자 살짝 긴장한 듯한데요.
You describe Qing policy to Joseon as leave well enough alone, suggesting that the Qing rulers saw signs that they were not loved and that they saw signs that their legitimacy was suspected. What does the greater willingness to leave well enough alone in foreign relations, what they would not leave well enough alone domestically, tell us about Qing rule?
Now, Kirk probably has something to say on this as well, because it is really quite interesting when you think about the character of the Qing regime, as Kirk pointed out in his comment earlier on, that it took them a relatively short period of time to get to grips with how to handle what could easily have been seen, and this you're absolutely right, as a direct, sustained challenge against their legitimacy and therefore the centrality of the state that they ruled over, at least on the surface, to go reasonably well. I think there is a tremendous pragmatism.
한참 세 사람의 대화가 이어지고 이제야 정신을 차리는데요.
That parallelism can be challenged. Questions from the floor? In the back.
기다렸다는 듯 바로 손을 드네요.
I noticed in one of the maps that the north appeared to be separated from the south. Was there a distinction between how the north was treated by China and whether or not the South felt that in their own righteousness they could identify themselves as being somewhat more separate.
Because of who were successful in the imperial examinations, where did a significant part of the elite come from, namely the South? It could be argued that among some leading southern families, the direct Chinese cultural influence was even stronger than what it was in the North. So I think one has to be very careful. I mean, there are distinctions, as everyone who's worked on Korea will know, not just between North and South, but also between East and West within the country. But the real significance, at least to get out of what I've said today, is that this is a remarkably long, remarkably stable, unified development within one common state. That's the big Joseon story to me.
그리고 질문 몇 개가 더 이어진 뒤에야 강의는 끝이 납니다.
And thank you to our speaker.
Thank you.
오늘 강의가 있었던 곳은 미국의 명문대 중 하나로 꼽히는 하버드 대학교. 이곳에서 하버드 교수님들을 모아놓고 한국에 대해 이야기하는 시간을 가졌는데요. 베스타 교수님은 예일대학교에서 냉전과 현대 동아시아 역사를 전문으로 하고 있습니다. 베스타 교수님은 특히 냉전의 역사를 재평가한 것으로 유명한데요. 우리 한국의 역사도 의로움이라는 마음으로 국난을 이겨냈다며 새로운 관점들을 내놓고 있습니다. 또한 그는 한국과 중국의 관계에 관심이 많은데요. 오래전 조선시대에는 중국과 좋은 관계를 유지했었지만 오히려 현재는 상황이 좋지 않은 것 같다며 걱정했습니다. 오늘 강의에서처럼 베스타 교수님은 한국을 의로운 나라, 중국을 제국이라 표현하며 한 권의 책을 내기도 했는데요. 제목은 제국과 의로운 민족. 그는 집필 활동을 하면서도 많은 사람들이 오해하기에 딱 좋다는 생각을 했다 합니다. 하지만 그럼에도 한국인들의 민족성과 정체성에 대해 글을 써야겠다 결심했던 것이죠. 그는 한국에 대해 이렇게 말합니다. 한국을 가장 잘 표현하는 말은 의로움입니다. 오늘 강의는 여기까지입니다. 시청해 주셔서 정말 감사합니다.